Don't call it a comeback. Ya miss me? Of course you did. You like the new look? This is me trying to cosplay an NPC from Hotline Miami. Or maybe, just maybe, an overweight Ryan Gosling. I'm trying my best, okay? Although actually, hold on 1 second. Let's try a little bit. Let's try a little bit. Yeah. Hey! We're back with a topic that is definitely just like a little off-brand for this channel. Back in the spring of 2020, when the rest of the world was, like, quite literally on fire, a little indie company you may know by the name of Wizards of the Coast triggered their canon event in creating a new set of playing cards for their trading card game Magic the Gathering, starring none other than the titular Toho Titans themselves. This would kick off a long-running history of crossovers with the popular TCG. Now, this channel's no stranger to the Big G, and it's no wonder that even I myself own a couple of cards from this set to this very day. I play Magic semi-casually nowadays, mostly sticking with Commander and purchasing pre-made Commander decks cause Lord knows your boy ain't smart enough to build his own deck. To someone not indoctrinated to Magic the Gathering, turn back now, you still have time. But if you are clicking on this video and you are brand new to Magic the Gathering, I'd suggest going elsewhere. There are far too many channels to count that are way more informational and far more intelligent than myself, and are better resources for you to learn how to play the game. I will explain the rules as I go, so if you want to stick around, it's your fault. But my strength is talking about the things that I love, and while Godzilla Magic the Gathering crossover cards were certainly placed into the right set for the job, what with starring in the setting of Ikoria, a realm in Magic known for giant monsters, the problem with the Godzilla cards is that they were the first of their kind. Much like power creep in everything, the old stuff just isn't as good as the new. Future MTG crossovers would draft original card designs based off of the crossover material, what with introducing brand new mechanics that were exclusive to the crossover. But for Godzilla and company, these cards were essentially the trading card game equivalent of skins. They weren't mechanically unique as kaiju monsters, they were reskins of existing cards to the set, and thus those cards were balanced accordingly to the set they were located in. Today, I say to hell with balance, it's not like Wizards cares anymore. Godzilla is a brand that demands presence and commands relevancy in whatever brand it's crossing over with. Whether they are an unstoppable force of nature fighting the Justice League or beans. The Toho brand deserves far more respect than simply reskins and paintovers. Which is why today I want you to join me on the creative process as I remake all of the Godzilla Magic cards. Our first stop on the G-Train, baby! Wow! Is none other than Godzilla himself. And what's funny is that I can actually use Godzilla as kind of a jumping off point to help explain the baseline of Magic for those of you that have no clue what Magic is about or how to play. In Magic, you play against other players as you draw cards and play creatures to eventually attack the other player and take their life total to 0. The main thing that separates Magic from other card games is its resource system, mana. Oopsie doodle, wrong mana. I'm so sorry, camera! In Magic, you play land cards that serve as your mana pool. You then tap that land to produce mana of the corresponding color, and play creatures, enchantments, artifacts, a whole gaggle of things that will help you on your main journey to death. My remake of Godzilla is a commanding creature that steals the show on the battlefield as soon as it enters, and it does what Godzilla do best. Smash! When Godzilla, King of the Monsters, enters the battlefield under your control, destroy all other creatures, including your own. For each creature that was destroyed this way, you put a +1/+1 counter on Godzilla, essentially making him stronger for every creature destroyed as he entered the battlefield. And lastly, if Godzilla has 10 or greater total power, he gains hexproof and indestructible. There's a lot to unpack here, so let me take you back through. This card is a direct remake of the red-green monster from the original set. what was essentially a 7-3 with trample that says that lethal damage to creatures that you control is determined by their power rather than their toughness. Basically, if they hit harder and their toughness is lower, it doesn't matter. You're working off of that number. Sort of an inverse of the big booty strategy that most Magic players are accustomed to. Does this imply things that I'm not ready to cope with? While I did think that the color identity did match Godzilla pretty well, his ability is underwhelming. It just makes him a 7-7 with trample, and sure, he makes other creatures more durable for potentially cheaper, but Godzilla does far more than that. Godzilla is a much more prominent creature, and I wanted to showcase the destruction aspect that every iteration of Godzilla embodies. I mentioned color identity. Now, let's address that just very briefly before we get too deep in, since it will help contextualize all the other cards I've remade. Magic has 5 different colors of mana, of which you spend to play creatures and other things. Each color represents a different vibe, a different ideology, a different type of magic, not the cards, literal magic, that every single color has a different vibe to. Red is for fire, aggression, and passion. Green is for nature, life, animals, and plants. White is for law, order, the light, kind of a holier-than-thou sort of color. Black is for death, decay, and greed. And lastly, blue is a piece of shit. Fuck blue. Nobody likes blue. All my homies hate blue. The colors express these ideas on their own, and in combinations with other colors will also result in combinations of those themes. With this in mind, Godzilla being red-green makes the most sense for a destructive force of nature. So it was only natural to keep it that way with his remake. Lastly, I want to explain hexproof and indestructible, as those aren't really keywords you'll find too very often in Magic. Hexproof means that the creature cannot be directly targeted by other spells, effects, and creature effects. While indestructible means that the creature cannot be destroyed neither by combat nor effects that explicitly say destroy or damage. Meaning that the keyword exile is the only way to remove the big G from play. A little strong, wouldn't you say? Look, Godzilla is the one fictional character I know of that has a legally binding contract that says that he cannot lose in a fight with anything in his crossover material. So I'm pretty sure he's him, if you get my drift. Next up is Rodan, the flying monster. A 4/4 for 4 mana in mono red with flying and first strike. Whenever a creature with flying you control attacks, you may have it fight target creature you don't control instead. If a creature you don't control would be destroyed this way, you then gain life equal to its toughness. That is again the second number on the bottom right hand corner. A couple of mechanics to explain and lots of flavor to go down the list, so WTF is fighting. In Magic, creatures can only attack other players by default. Fighting essentially removes that restriction and lets a creature duke it out with a creature mono-e-mono and dealing damage to each other equal to their power and surviving based on their toughness. This allows a creature to deal damage to another creature without the other creature having to block them first. While he looks like a giant pteranodon, he's actually more inspired by the famous Birds of Rebirth more than anything. What with living in a volcano, breathing fire, and being reborn from death. Which is why Mono Red felt the most fitting for the giant beaky boy. In comparison, his original version is, meh. For starters, this card utilized the mutate mechanic, which essentially says you can cast it for its mutate cost and put it on top of another creature, while retaining the abilities of the original creature, as well as the mutate creature's abilities, and using the stats of the creature that is on top. Very confusing, but flavorful if we're talking about mutation in the literal sense. Maybe would have been better for Fallout, I guess, but we're here. A literal mutation in flavor is cool, but Rodan's a kaiju of the natural world, so this is a flavor fail! Also, red, white, and blue is not Rodan's color identity at all. Rodan is very typically acting of his own accord, a very selfish monster even though he is a natural being. No law, no order, just pure chaos, so white doesn't make sense here. And blue is for smart boys, and look at this guy, you think he's got a PhD? I thought so, moving on. Just like you should have hit the like and subscribe button by now. Seeing as you're clearly a fan of games and giant monsters, then ya boy is the right place to be. I hope you're enjoying the video so far, and don't forget to show the algorithm some of that love. Moving right along. Our favorite 3-headed, no arms, no bitches have an ass dragon, King Ghidorah. King Ghidorah Monster Zero is a 6-mana 6/3 flyer with double strike in Grixis colors.
That's red, blue, black for those of you that still have money in their bank.
His ability says that you can spend 2 mana plus a red to have King Ghidorah deal 1 damage to target creature and place a stun counter on them. Subsequently, whenever a creature with a stun counter on it has that stun counter removed, you can goad that creature. Lots of words, and I'm sure the average Giga Chad that doesn't play Magic needs a bit more of an explanation. Double strike means that whenever that creature deals damage to a creature or player, they deal that damage first before block damage is calculated. And then they also deal that same damage again. Meaning that if King Ghidorah gets ya, all 3 heads are chomping at least twice. Stun counters mean that whenever a creature is tapped to attack, that creature does not untap on your next turn. Rather, the stun counter is removed instead, to which that creature then untaps on that player's next turn, effectively keeping them out of commission for 2 total turns. Lastly, goading a creature means that you are forcing that creature to attack on that player's next turn if able, and attack players that are not you if possible. Because Commander is a 4-player format, you typically prefer when your opponents are beating the smack out of each other instead of you. This all culminates into what I think King Ghidorah represents the most, which is malice and manipulation of the battlefield. He of course gets a fire breathing effect because all 3 heads go brrrr. And the damage is not inconsequential because you can keep pumping the ability to deal more damage as long as you have enough mana. But the real star of the show here is the stun mechanic mixed with goading. King Ghidorah very frequently is shown to use his electricity even when he bites other monsters. Electricity often stuns those that come to cross paths with it, unless you're, I don't know, unless you're built different or something. And King Ghidorah is famous for turning other monsters against one another in the Titan world. So all of this is meant to exemplify that battlefield instigation and chaos. OG King Ghidorah, Jesus, what a hot mess this thing is. For starters, being in teamer colors, green, blue, red, makes anything but sense, since King Ghidorah is shown for being anything but natural to the native planet of which he's typically invading. So green didn't feel like it made any sense for a non-natural alien kaiju. Swapping that for black, given that King Ghidorah is often aligned with greedy and unnatural forces, felt at home in my mind. And whenever he mutates, he exiles cards from your library until you get a non-land permanent card that you can then play for free or put into your hand. This is one big fat resounding meh from me, dude. King Ghidorah is the big bad of all kaiju-dom, Godzilla's arch nemesis, and the only kaiju that has ever even come close to killing him. Well, foreshadowing. Ghidorah at his core is a bastard, and his abilities as a legendary creature in the TCG Magic the Flippin' Gathering should convey that. Next up is Mothra, Queenie of the Monstinis, a 5-mana mono-white 5/5 with Flying, Convoke, and Vigilance. You may tap her to put a pollen counter on target creature you don't control, and a -1/-1 counter on Mothra. When Mothra, Queen of the Monsters, dies, put a number of 1/1 white worm creature tokens on the battlefield equal to the number of creatures with pollen counters on them. There's some all-night special custom flavor happening here, so allow me to explain what all of these counters are actually doing. Very often in Magic, counters mean something that you can put on a creature or another permanent that you control that alters its behavior, like making it stronger or giving it an extra ability or attribute. Pollen counters do none of that. They just exist and get in your eyes, make them water, and make me hate everything! The pollen counters are to be a direct foil to Mothra's second ability, where she spawns token creatures after she dies. That's why the -1/-1 mechanic is built into the card. -1/-1 counters make a creature progressively weaker, and when their toughness hits 0, they're donezo. Dead. Dunyan rings. This is to both keep Mothra in check from spawning enough worms to make Paul Atreides sweat, under the sea or something. The death mechanic here is to encourage Mothra's cycle of constant rebirth through her offspring, which is also why she has Convoke, where you can tap creatures to pay for a generic mana in the creature's mana cost. Given that Mono White loves token generation and playing with counters and amassing large armies, I'm sure that Mothra's Wormies will fit into any standard Mono White army. And in truth, Mothra's original card wasn't too bad either. She's still mono white for 4 mana, and admittedly, Mothra's OG version in Magic was actually potentially one of the strongest cards of the set.
allowing for a non-flying creature to be reanimated with a flying counter on it after it returns to the battlefield.
This felt very Mothra, to tell you the truth, and I almost considered not even remaking her, because it was just so consistent and had plenty of dat flavor. Just goes to show that Mothra is peak, no matter what iteration you choose. My baby girl Destoroyah is probably my favorite Godzilla villain, right next to Space Godzilla. Quit judging me, I see what makes you cheer!
So in Remaking Destoroyah, as the one kaiju that has technically been successful in contributing to Godzilla's demise, I had to make sure that she was a certified threat to big creatures. Destoroyah is a 7/5 for 6 mana in black and red with flying and death touch. If she's blocked by a creature with power 6 or greater, she then gains first strike until end of turn. Subsequently, creatures you control while she's on the battlefield cost X less to cast, where X is the greatest power among opponents' creatures who have died this turn. The fabled first strike death touch interaction is one very infamous amongst Magic players.
First Strike is the pre-evolved form of Double Strike. It just allows you to deal damage before anything else does without the, double. However, Death Touch means that any damage dealt, no matter how big or small, will always be lethal to the creature it is dealt damage to. Whether it's 1 or 10, you can kill anything that isn't indestructible.
Meaning that if you try to block Destoroyah with anything with 6 power or greater, she will always win that fight. You have to block her with something that has 5 power or less, thus most likely sacrificing your own creature to her wrath. She's a tank buster through and through, and cultivates spawning more creatures from her own destruction, just like in the movie that first featured her glory. Her original version was very confusing in terms of why they chose a phoenix to represent her. She has a mutate mechanic that says you create a red artifact feather token, where you then tap any mana and sacrifice the feather, and return a phoenix card from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Essentially, if you mutate to get her, you can always guarantee you will get her back by resurrecting, which is fine, I guess?
Honestly, this specific card would have been better suited as a reskin for Rodan, what with being a mono-red phoenix. But it's clear that the only Godzilla fans on the team were the artists rather than the card designers, because how did we let this happen? Gigan! Rise! And like and subscribe to while you're at it!
Gigan's Cybernetic Doom is a 0/1 for X and any combination of 2 blue and or black mana. He's an artifact creature with menace that says whenever he enters the battlefield, he enters with X +1/+1 counters, where X is how much mana was spent to cast him. Lastly, while he's on the battlefield, you may cast artifacts from your graveyard, and any artifacts cast this way will enter the battlefield with a finality counter on them.
Designing Gigan was fun for me since I finally got to introduce a proper theme to the creature itself, and I think Gigan mixing with artifacts just made a ton of sense. And if there's anything you know about this stupid metal chicken, it's that he's always compensating for something. So, let's dig in.
First, the X in his mana cost. To my knowledge, X is allowed to be 0, so at minimum, Gigan will always enter the battlefield as a 2/3 with Menace. Menace meaning that he must always be blocked by at least 2 creatures and apply his damage to each. This also implies that if you're playing him in Commander, whenever he's destroyed and returned to the command zone, the fabled Commander tax will cause him to always cost 2 more generic mana every time you cast him, thus causing him to grow in size and be a bigger and bigger threat every time you bring him back. Speaking of always coming back, Gigan allows you to resurrect artifact cards from your graveyard. Just like I mentioned with counters on Mothra, a finality counter on a permanent says that whenever this permanent leaves the battlefield next, it does not go back to the graveyard, but rather goes to exile.
For my Yu-Gi-Oh homies, think the Shadow Realm. There's very few cards in Magic that can return stuff from exile, so the finality in finality counter is very literal.
So Gigan allows you to utilize artifacts in a big way by recurring them, but at the cost of potentially never seeing them again once they leave the battlefield next. High stakes, high reward card that allows for constant adaptation and shenanigans with artifacts in the graveyard. Original Gigan kept with the blue-black theming, which I agree on for Gigan as an alien cyborg. He also comes with Companion, and dear God, I'm not explaining Companion, otherwise we'll be here until Mr. Beast is old enough to be president. Please, for the love of God. But Original Gigan's other ability states that whenever he enters the battlefield, that each player mills the top 4 cards of their library into their graveyard, then returns one of those creatures that was milled this way onto the battlefield that has an even converted mana cost from amongst those cards onto the battlefield under your control. 6 mana for an ability that maybe could net you some funny results in a 4-player game is inconsistent at best. And while I've always made fun of Big Bird over here, he deserves far, far better than this. A fan-favorite Godzilla villain that still hasn't seen the revival that she deserves. Biollante, Nature's Revenge, is a 7-mana 7/7 with Trample that says when Biollante enters the battlefield under your control, create X01 plant tokens, where X is the number of creatures that have died this turn. In addition, plant creatures you control have sacrificed this creature, add a green mana to your mana pool. Biollante's biggest asset to her arsenal has always been the manipulation of plants and nature around her, and I felt that the manipulation of life and death fit perfectly within the Golgari color scheme, also known as green-black. This color combination loves to see creatures die, whether it's yours or your opponent's, to always create some kind of added benefit for you. Sacrificing, destroying, what have you. As long as there is a constant cycle of death amongst the battlefield, Biollante will always be able to regrow the battlefield with tons of tokens that can not only be decent blockers, but also have a direct sacrifice outlet that nets you some extra mana. There's a Pokemon joke in here somewhere, I swear. Bulbasaur! Use Rigor Mortis Speed! Original Biollante got the job done in a similar fashion, but again, it's behind this weird mutate mechanic, which technically mutation does match Biollante pretty well. Fine, I'll admit, that flavor. But you're also only allowed to resurrect creatures with a total of 10 power or less. You could get a bunch of tiny creatures or one biggin from your graveyard, but that's about it. And only if the creature mutates. I wanted to exemplify the plant aspect to the plant kaiju, and I think that generating mana off of destruction is the best way to get that across. Now, I know I said I was remaking all of the Godzilla cards, and I still am. We've got a couple more down the list to remake and retouch, and I haven't forgotten about a single one of them. But this video's already getting a wee bit long, and I think it's time we wrap it up for today. So you can join me on part 2, where I dig in on even more Godzilla card remakes, plus some original creations. Ooh, the suspense! But I do want to thank you so much for clicking on this video. Don't forget to drop a like and show the algorithm some of that love. Also, don't forget to subscribe for more content, as you will not want to miss part 2 when that comes out very soon.
Drawing out the content to entice viewers to return, thus generating more traffic and more revenue. Excellent use of algorithm manipulation. Sounds like more dollar signs to me. Ruh-roh, Raggy.
That better not be more All Night lore that I'm hearing, because this channel has plenty of that already.
Too late!